We have a terrific panel to begin this event, and befitting the broad label Legalism and the Jews, there's a wide variety of papers. Let me begin first with David Berger, the Brooklyndian Professor of Law, Brooklyn College, and the Graduate Center, City University of New York.
The error is more than understandable given the setting, but it's Professor of History. This talk will actually not deal with American Jewish lawyers or anything of the sort. I was asked to give an introductory talk about the issue of Jewish law itself and legalism, which I've called Text, Values, and Historical Change, Reflections on the Dynamics of Jewish Law. The image of Jewish law as a self-contained fortress, impervious to the slings and arrows of external fortunes or extra-legal ideologies and values, has been nurtured by two very different forces. For centuries, even millennia, Christian authors depicted Judaism as a legalistic religion, indifferent to considerations of loving kindness and grace. The letter killeth, said Paul, but the Spirit giveth life. An early Protestant joke told of a Catholic priest who mistakenly placed an inedible object into the mouth of a communicant. After waiting an intolerably long time for it to melt on his tongue, the parishioner exclaimed, "Father, you have made a mistake. You have given me God the Father. He is so hard and tough, he will never dissolve." Under the impact of religious and intellectual transformations in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Christian scholars contrasted the legalism and ethical backwardness of rabbinic Judaism with the spiritually refreshing and ethically sensitive message of Jesus. Jews from across the religious spectrum denounced these assertions, contending that they were rooted in both ignorance and anti-Jewish bias. Some of these denunciations were not without their irony, since Reformed Jews who had abandoned many of the rituals of Judaism for reasons by no means alien to the rhetoric of Christian critics now composed paeans of praise to the spiritually uplifting character of the minutiae of rabbinic law. Now, however, we confront a very different irony. Some Orthodox Jews, acting out of the deepest loyalty to Jewish law and angrily rejecting hostile evaluations of Jewish ethics, respond to what they see as the utter abandonment of legal discipline advocated by Reform and even conservative Judaism, by reinforcing the view that halakha, Jewish law, is marked by a self-contained analysis of texts, allowing for very little consideration of changed historical circumstances, external pressures, ideological concerns, and even human sensitivities. To a large degree, the debate about halachic flexibility is carried out on both sides by recourse to straw men. On the one hand, a legal system whose practitioners have sincerely believed in its divine origin cannot reasonably be expected to have treated it as potters treat their clay. On the other, no legal system could have remained viable from the period of the Talmuds to the contemporary age if it had not responded to human needs and even ideological transformations in ways that looked beyond the straightforward meaning of its inherited texts. In this presentation, I will attempt to depict certain patterns of halachic reevaluation that emerged in response to new economic, humanitarian, and religious concerns. The significant variables determining such reevaluation include inter alia, the seriousness of the need, ideological convictions, the susceptibility of the text to reasonable reinterpretation, the severity of the prohibition in question, popular instincts regarding that prohibition, and the attitude of the decisor and his community to the likelihood that popular practice may be in error. At the risk of classifying myself as the rabbinic golem, who addresses the last point first and the first point last, let me begin with the last point. Chaim Soloveitchik has argued that in the Middle Ages, the self-image of a community was a central factor in determining whether or not popular custom would be overridden. Ashkenazic authorities were more likely to defend prevailing practice because they perceived their communities favorably, while Sephardic rabbis were more willing to assume that their fellow Jews were sinners out of either ignorance or indifference. In a celebrated article, Soloveitchik has applied this insight to contemporary Jewry, maintaining that in the last few generations, Orthodox Jews have lost confidence in the traditions that they learned from their parents, so that they have replaced a mimetic society with one that tests all prevailing practices against the standards established by texts. Ideological considerations have played an interesting and sometimes ironic role in the reception of that article. Many modern Orthodox Jews have expressed satisfaction with its thesis because Soloveitchik's examples of deviation from traditional behaviors tend to involve text-based stringencies, such as the increased size of the required measure of matzah, and such innovations are ideal grist for mockery directed at the orthodoxies of the right. Modernist ideology, however, can also trump mimesis. Thus, some of those who lionize the mimetic society as they savor the anti-Haredi uses of Soloveitchik's analysis are impelled by feminist convictions to change generations of synagogue practice on the basis of textual analysis far more tenuous than the considerations that lead the traditionalist Orthodox to their usually stringent deviations from the practices of the past. Affirmation or rejection of a mimetic ideal can depend very much on whose ox is being gored. I shall soon return to women's issues in even more sensitive contexts, but let me first make some observations about the much-studied reactions of rabbinic decisors to serious economic pressures that beset Jews in the Middle Ages. When facing a prohibition of rabbinic rather than biblical status, the difficulties of ruling leniently in the face of economic necessity were substantially mitigated. Thus, in a particularly striking illustration of this point, Ritva, a 14th century authority, made the frontal assertion that the rabbinic prohibitions against business dealings with idolaters on pagan holidays, lest they thank their gods, was never intended to apply in cases when economic survival was at stake. Even more strikingly, and with consequences that most medieval authorities are not likely to have foreseen, new assertions about the Jewish evaluation of Christianity emerged out of the crucible of these medieval economic realities. Thus, contemporary Christians, said the Tosafists, 12th and 13th century Northern European authorities, are not as likely to respond to a business arrangement with a thanksgiving prayer to their deity. When this point is formulated as, quote, contemporary Gentiles do not worship idolatry, unquote, interesting conclusions can be drawn in subsequent generations. When Tosafot permitted another sort of business arrangement on the grounds that what they called association is not forbidden to non-Jews, the seeds were sown for the later affirmation that Judaism considers the worship of Jesus along with God entirely permissible for non-Jews. In other words, when straightforward law is leavened by other considerations, it is not just the law in question that can be affected. Despite what Soloveitchik once called, or rather I should say, it's not just the law in question, not that particular law that can be affected, ideology can be affected, and despite what Soloveitchik once called halachic federalism, a position initially intended to apply to a focused, restricted context cannot always be expected to know its place. Bush v. Gore is, or at least may soon become, an instructive case in point. All or virtually all of these medieval arguments for permitting problematic economic activity are perfectly plausible. The underlying question is whether, as Jacob Katz and others have taken for granted, the permissibility of such business dealings was absolutely predetermined by the economic realities that faced medieval Jews. Despite the instincts of historians, one cannot be utterly certain that the answer to this question is affirmative. Rabbi Yechiel of Paris told his interlocutors during the Paris Disputation of 1240 that if Jews did not sincerely believe that contemporary Christians were different from ancient pagans in legally relevant ways, they would not suspend Talmudic law affecting economic matters. After all, he said, we have provided abundant evidence that we are willing to die for our faith. As it happens, the grounds for suspending those laws did not require the far-reaching re-evaluation of the status of Christians that Rabbi Yechiel preferred in the disputation. Moreover, the embrace of martyrdom in moments of religious ecstasy may well be more likely than the willingness of an entire community to commit slow economic suicide. Still, the observation that Jews would not provide knowingly insincere excuses for violating the Torah is surely correct. Israel Tashma, the distinguished scholar who dealt with some of these issues, once told me that one's initial inclination is to assume that rabbinic decisors would conjure up any available interpretation, however flimsy, to justify a conclusion required for economic survival. Nonetheless, he added, as one reads the arguments of a figure like Rabbeinu Tam in detail, an unexpected reaction begins to develop. To wit, this conclusion is actually correct. While this may be a tribute to Rabbeinu Tam's genius, it says something important about the subtlety and complexity of the interplay between communal needs and textual analysis. Rabbeinu Tam himself famously asserted in a related context that it is a mitzvah to provide Jews with sustenance. And this leads us to a key element in this discussion, to wit, the overt consideration of concerns that are not part of the narrow textual discourse. I call these competing religious values, by which I mean that they compete with the legal conclusion that would follow from a simple reading of the directly relevant texts. It is, moreover, important to note that what Rabbeinu Tam's formulation affirms, namely that the recognition of economic needs is itself a religious value, and it may legitimately be considered in choosing a plausible halachic position over a competing one that would be more compelling in a world without real people and critical human needs.